people should take religion more seriously, and people should have a default view that God is probably watching them like right now as they podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to The Context Window. Today's guest is Ross Douthat. Ross is a longtime columnist at the New York Times, author of 7 books, and one of the most distinctive and influential voices on the American right. He has incredible range, writing about politics, culture, religion, family life, and the future of liberal democracy. He also graduated from Harvard, class of 2002, and his first book was about his experience there. It was called Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. So you can see he has a point of view. I ask him if his view has changed, which maybe it has a little. We also explore his critique of modern meritocracy, and even whether Harvard and other elite universities should admit students with a random lottery. His criticism is biting at times, but I appreciate it. His latest book is called Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. I grew up in the church, so I was especially interested in his argument. We spent the first few minutes geeking out about the evidence for God, and I even asked him, what would make you less likely to believe? I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you're going to love it too. Please send me feedback by emailing me at david@thecontextwindow.com. Enjoy the show. Ross, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
You are the New York Times resident proselytizer, right? Having written Believe.
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely.
Yes,
that's what I am.
I really enjoyed the book, but I felt as though it was a bit targeted to me as a kind of intellectual in the bastion of liberal thought. And so I wondered, when I read the book, and I've read other books like Believe that make the case that you should believe in God, if you were targeting a particular audience, were you targeting New York Times readers when you wrote the book? Who was it for?
I mean, every book is for everyone, obviously, right? Anyone, anywhere. No, I think the book was pretty self-consciously targeted toward people who think about religion and religious ideas and arguments in a pretty cerebral and self-consciously intellectual way, and it would be silly to pretend otherwise. And also, even within that terrain, right? Like, one of the things you notice once you go out and promote a book about religion is just, the diversity of people's engagement with religion, religious experience, religious ideas is so vast that you're never going to write the argument that is for everyone, right? So the book is trying to claim, belief in God is very reasonable.
Yes.
Right? You don't have to set aside the entire architecture of modern scientific thought to think there's probably a God. And so, I stand up and give a spiel about that at an Ivy League university, maybe.
Yes, for example.
And inevitably, someone would stand up and say, well, this is all very interesting, but, one of the things that drew me to religion was the chance to escape from the tyranny of Western reason and, the sort of heavy hand of would-be logical rationality and so on, right? And, I'm not going to stand up and tell that person, well, that was the wrong path to religion. Probably it was a better path than my own.
So one of the reasons I thought the book spoke to me was I'm a preacher's kid. And in your writing, both in Believe and other writing, having spent a lot of time in the church, I detect in you the zeal of the convert. So tell me a little bit about your conversion to Catholicism.
So I don't know about that. I mean,
okay.
I converted to Catholicism when I was either 16 or 17 years old, depending on how you chart it. So I am in the rare third category where I am neither a cradle Catholic, from suburban Long Island or, any other greater Chicago, any other zone of old-fashioned Irish Italian Catholicism, but nor am I someone who had like a 25-year intellectual odyssey to becoming an adult convert. And I sort of think of myself as actually being in between the two categories. So I have I obviously have certain sort of features that are characteristic of a convert. I write books trying to persuade people to become religious, right? I get very invested in debates about the minutia of Catholic doctrine and what the Pope is doing and so on. These are things that converts absolutely do. At the same time, though, I don't think that I have a fundamentally zealous personality. And I say that in part because I converted in the shadow of my parents' religious journey, my mother's religious journey especially. And she had much more of a kind of dramatic, personal, mystical experience.
At a Pentecostal.
We were at faith healing services,
Yeah.
Pentecostal churches, revivals. Like I like to say that I spent my weeks as a kid going to a nice, respectable, secular private school, and my weekends watching my parents speak in tongues. And that's an exaggeration in the sense it wasn't every weekend, but that actually describes a real phase of my life. But I didn't have those experiences. I was sort of an observer who was sort of in a position of believing that I was watching something real. It was whatever religious experience is, it's not fake, right? So something was actually happening, something that was important, something that was not necessarily covered in the major newspapers, not necessarily reckoned with fully at Harvard University, but it was something that I always was approaching from a little bit more of a remove than people having the experience myself. So there's always a little, like, I have, I guess, a little bit of the kind of William James, like, let's analyze what's going on here thing. And I think that comes into my writing too. I wrote a book, maybe it's sort of characteristic of this balance. I wrote a book that ends by making the case for Christianity. Like, I'm a Christian. I'm not going to deceive anyone that that's where I'd like you to end up. But a lot of the book is just trying to sort of paint a more general picture and saying, here's how you might approach religion from a lot of different angles. If you start to think there might be a God but aren't persuaded by any particular faith, what do you do next? So, I don't know. I mean, other people can judge, but I do think of myself as occupying a sort of weird middle ground between sort of convert and bred in the bone styles of faith.
Here's how I'd say it. You describe the emotional experience that your mother had, and you said that wasn't for me, but I would say you're intellectually zealous about Catholicism and about religion. That's where I wanted to ask you about that, because having attended a Pentecostal service a few times in my childhood myself, and also having attended a few Catholic masses, these things are worlds apart, as you alluded to. And so I wonder, do you think you're Catholic because Catholicism is the one true tradition, or do you think you're Catholic because it suits your personality?
I think that I became Catholic because, well, first of all, again, I became Catholic because I was in the wake of someone else's journey, right? So what happens to 20-year-old Ross or 30-year-old Ross in a different timeline is honestly somewhat obscure to me. There is certainly a way in which my adolescent self found Catholicism very congenial in the sense that, in part because I wasn't speaking in tongues or having mystical experiences, and in part because I was just an awkward teenager, right? Going from a world where, you are frequently called upon to kind of perform your faith like that. If you've been inside sort of Pentecostal and charismatic world, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of performance, public testimony, people asking you how the Lord Jesus has changed your life. To go from that to, at Mass, you go into the back pew, you memorize the prayers, nobody bothers you. There's a set of sacraments where the promise of the church is these things work even if you aren't overcome with a mystical encounter with God. You can still be confident. Like, you go to confession and you don't feel some buzzing vibration in your body, your sins are still forgiven, right? I think to who I was at that point, definitely Catholicism fit a certain set of attitudes and perspectives. And I feel like I have a pretty good understanding also of why people who are raised in liturgical traditions, Catholicism, other traditions like it, who feel like they're looking for that kind of spark, that kind of like divine inrushing, and don't find it, can end up sort of drifting away or being pulled into, again, sort of more intense Pentecostal and charismatic worlds. I think if you were interviewing my mother, she would say that actually there is this bridge between these traditions, and that the Catholic mystical tradition, in terms of experience and description and what Catholic mystics encounter and describe, actually has plenty in common with Pentecostal and charismatic traditions. But certainly one difference is the mystical is centered in Pentecostalism in a way that in Catholicism, even if you say, well, obviously there's a mystery happening every Sunday on the altar, it still is possible, obviously, to sort of pass through a Catholic Mass and not have a sense of that.
Well, that's the sense in which I was asking you about the zeal of the convert. I don't think zeal is a bad thing. The way I read this, and maybe it's an overread, is that you were deeply drawn to religion from a young age, but had this experience that really ran the gamut of the emotional to the intellectual, and that you found in the Catholic Church the marriage between your deep desire or your calling to believe and your personality and your love of ponderous reading of Scripture and a kind of slightly removed. Is that accurate, you think? Again, going back to your 17-year-old self, not yourself today.
I think the 17-year-old self, yes, found in Catholicism something that combined sort of a certain kind of religious intensity and seriousness with a certain intellectual tradition. So I came into Catholicism in the late 1990s. John Paul II was Pope. He was getting old, but the whole sort of culture and atmosphere around him, especially in conservative Catholicism, was still incredibly strong. And there was a kind of narrative at that point on the conservative side of Catholicism, which is where I was, that the church had gone through this kind of convulsion in the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council. A bunch of changes had been made, but John Paul II had come along and, with the help of Joseph Ratzinger, who became the next pope, had sort of resolved the tensions and difficulties and sort of settled where Catholicism stood. And I would say the last 20 years in various ways have unsettled that settlement. And some of it just has to do with sort of events within the church, the sex abuse scandals and other things associated with that. Some of it just has to do with the arguments back and forth and the intensity of intra-Catholic conflict, especially during the Pope Francis era, which I, for my sins, got pulled deeply into. But I think that has made me maybe a little bit less zealous than I would have been just about, does Catholicism have all the answers sort of settled? Here's the catechism, we've got it taken care of. I probably have a little less zeal on that front, but I think I probably have a little more zeal on the basic questions of, is there a God and is religion important? So that again, though, is sort of an odd, I'm very zealous for the idea that people should take religion more seriously and people should have a default view that God is probably watching them right now as they podcast, right? I'm very, that's where I'm most zealous, I guess. Can I ask you, what kind of preacher's kid were you?
Methodist.
Whereabouts?
In and around Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah, so I very much grew up in the church. My mom was an editor at a religious book publishing company.
Which
so
one?
My parents met Upper Room Ministries.
Okay.
And my parents met in seminary at Emory. So I grew up in the church. And when I came to Harvard, getting to know colleagues, and somehow it came up, my background came up, and they said, "Oh, do you still attend church regularly?" And I said, I don't as much anymore. And they said, "Oh, so are you an atheist?" And I said, "Well, I'm not an atheist. I'm not sure if God exists." And they said, "Oh, so you're agnostic." And I said, agnostic implies to me a kind of searching, a wondering. I said, and this is 20 years ago too, I said, I think I've given up on knowing, on the idea that I will ever know whether God exists. So how would you convince somebody like me who's thought a lot about it, doesn't have a view either way, and just doesn't think they'll ever know?
The first thing that I would say is just, it's still a rather important question.
Of course.
Right?
The most important question.
Okay. There are lots of important questions, right, that are less important than this question, let's say, where you as a academic, a leader of a major university, a husband, a father, an American citizen, right, you make choices and do things and sort of orient your life in particular ways without 100% certainty, right, all the time.
Of course.
You have no way of being
course.
100% certain about any vote you cast. Maybe you feel 100% certain about your vote sometimes, but the sort of decisions you make or commitments you make to worldviews, ideologies.
I never feel 100% certain about anything.
Okay, good, right. So so the question of God, you feel like you're never going to be certain, but you concede that it's really important, right? So why would you not then make a set of choices in your life that sort of take it seriously, right?
Well, perhaps I have, but that's different than the question of belief. So I could say, look, I'll never know whether God exists. This is Pascal's wager. I'll never know if God exists, but on the off chance God does exist, I better behave as though God exists. So you can separate the question of belief from the question of what you ought to do in the event that it is true.
So Pascal's wager, in the crudest form, with apologies to Pascal, right, assumes that it doesn't matter how improbable the existence of God is, as long as it's possible,
right?
Because the stakes are so absolute.
Forever is a long time.
You need to act as if it might be.
Eternal damnation is
Right.
really bad.
But I don't think, it doesn't sound to me like you think there's a like 0.0001% chance that there's a God, right? Like you're giving me a shrug.
Yeah.
You're like, well, I'm not sure what the number is. So
Yeah.
I guess the question would be, well, if I could,
It's probably higher than
if I could,
0.0001.
if I could
Yeah.
take you up to, a sort of 52% assumption, would that lead you to change your life in any particular way?
Oh, but see, that's a different question. So the question is, can I act in all ways as though I am following the teachings of the gospel and not believe at all? Yes, I can. And so I think one natural response might be the question of belief.
Right,
might
but
actually be irrelevant.
people don't do that. I would say, as a generalization, that there is a zone. Yeah, there's a zone of human religious activity that people can occupy, where yes, they are lit. They think it probably isn't true, but live as if it is. That zone, in general, I think, both on a societal level and on a personal level, is a very unstable zone, and it tends to fall apart pretty quickly. So yeah, I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible to live that way. But I am saying that there is some binding connection between what you believe and what you do that's important, and it's not enough. So I think one thing that people who write about religion for secular audiences often tend to do is, because the question of belief itself seems so personal and difficult to resolve and so on, you tend to sort of, and also weird, right? Like, oh, there's an invisible mind, organizing all of reality. That's pretty strange,
and
right?
sort of deeply inconsistent with, for example, the life of an academic or somebody who does empirical things for a living. Like your whole life is predicated on, I don't believe you until you prove it. And then you're basically asking somebody to step outside that and have faith, which is belief in the absence of evidence.
Right, but I think you already conceded that you believe in all kinds of things without proof in your ordinary life. Like you believe in, the wisdom of a particular strategy for development at Harvard University. You believe that your wife loves you. Those are things that you would say you believe, that you're not 100% certain of, right? But you weigh the evidence and you come up with a belief and you act on it, right?
In the sense that, only if in the sense that you must believe in anything you act on. So I would say there are a lot of decisions I have to make, either as a dean or anything else, where I'm really fundamentally uncertain, and maybe it's 52-48, but I have to go forward. Now, does that mean I believe wholeheartedly in the thing, or that I just believe it's the most probable outcome?
I guess I think maybe that is, to my mind, a kind of stumbling block that people get into with religion, where they assume that the category of belief in God is different, higher, more intense than the ordinary kind of lower level belief that you believe it when you commit to a given academic strategy. Although there is terrain in between. When you say your marriage vows, right, you are committing to, you presumably hope to have more than a 52% certainty that your spouse actually loves you.
Yes.
You don't have a 100% certainty. Nonetheless, you are making this commitment, expressing a belief on the basis of imperfect evidence. I think with religion, too, the challenge is like, the goal is not just to have 52% belief in God. The goal is to have a relationship with God, right? And to find yourself in a kind of communion with God, to have this kind of transformation. And all of that is, yes, certainly much higher and more profound and intense than the 52% belief you bring to a particular academic strategy. All that, for this level of the debate, I'm trying to convince you is that that's still an okay place to start when it comes to the decision to go to church or not.
So I think what you're trying to do is say, look, in some sense, your belief is manifest in your actions. And so if you, and it's certainly at a societal level, it's true that if you got more people going to church and just behaving as though they were part of a religious tradition, they would in some sense become more religion, that there's a connection between the action and the belief. But what I'm asking is...
But I'm saying that it runs the other way, or runs in a circular way. Like I feel like I know a number of secular religion-curious people who will say, well, I can't quite get to the point of believing in God, but maybe I should go to church or synagogue, right, or wherever, right, and then the belief will come. And that is sociologically true. That does happen. But I'm trying to convince you that before you do that, like, there is, in fact, much more than a 50% chance that God exists. So you shouldn't feel like you are trying to get to the belief through the action. You should have not the 100% perfect belief that people think they have to have, but a reasonable probabilistic belief that there's probably a God.
Yeah.
And then you go to church and see what happens next.
So since
now, I
we're-
know you've already gone
Yeah,
to church,
yeah.
so I'm not,
Yes, but so you're talking about belief updating, basically. Like how do you get closer? So let me ask you this question: what is a thing that would cause you to reduce your own probability that God exists? Is there evidence that would actually push you away from or pull you away from your belief in God? What would you need to see?
It's challenging because we've ended up in a kind of weird epistemic zone in terms of our understanding of the universe, right? Where, like, just to take one example,
Yeah.
one of the reasons that I think the argument for belief in God is, in fact, stronger today than it was 100 years ago,
Yes.
is that we know a lot more about what gets called the fine-tuning of the cosmos, right? All of the weird ways in which the reality of the universe is insanely finely calibrated to yield a particular order, to yield order at all, to yield a particular kind of order, to yield a particular kind of order that could ever yield planets, life, human beings. This is not what was anticipated by the best scientific minds 100 years ago, and it's something that if you had unrolled it as a hypothesis, I would say in like the late 19th century, people would say, well, if that had been proven true, then the case for God would look a bit better,
Yep.
right? So it has provisionally been proven true, so the case for God looks a bit better. Okay, then the non-believer or the skeptic or the person who doesn't want to default to God as an explanation for this, one of the claims they would make is, well, actually, maybe this is because we're in a multiverse, right? We're in an infinite, near infinite multiverse with trillions and trillions and trillions of universes.
And lots of Marvel movies.
And lots of Marvel movies, right? And right now, in the current landscape of debate, that's probably the best working alternative to a kind of theistic hypothesis to explain. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of saying why, even if there was a multiverse, there still probably would be a God.
Why not?
Because I want to answer your question. Let's just say that these are the alternatives.
Okay.
If our universe is the only one there is, belief in God looks more probable. If the multiverse exists, belief in God looks less probable.
You made a more general argument in your book, which is that as we discover the complexity, like science discovers things like the existence of a vast universe beyond our solar system, or evolution and natural selection, or quantum mechanics, that this deepens the mystery in some sense and says, look, there's unimaginable complexity out there, it must be designed, right? So that is evidence of intelligent design, right?
The complexity, the fine-tuning, I would put it this way, sort of the initial exposure to the size of the universe and the scale of the universe, I think, understandably causes problems for a religious perspective that has a kind of cozy view of the cosmos, where it's like human beings are here, heaven is up there, there's a few planets, some angels, and that's it. So that is sort of the, even Pascal, who we were talking about, says, the silence of these infinite spaces fills me with.
But that was the argument I understood you to be making.
But the argument I'm making is that as you learn more about what actually shapes that vastness and how ordered it is and how calibrated it is, suddenly Earth becomes, if not the center of the universe, a center of the universe again. On the evidence we have about how the cosmos is ordered relative to all other possible cosmoses, there are good reasons to think that Earth is the kind of thing that this cosmos was made for, notwithstanding the fact that we are a very small planet. I don't think from the perspective of the religious believer it should be surprising that complexity comes from simplicity. The claim of the believer is that the existence of simple things that yield complexity is itself a problem in search of explanation, right? Yes. And I co-taught a class at Yale with a friend, a class on sort of philosophy and religious arguments with a friend who's a philosophy professor and an agnostic with sympathy for atheist arguments. And in one of the sort of endless back and forths we had, we sort of came down to this question of, well, let's say you could reduce the entire cosmos to a set of beautiful but simple equations.
Yes.
Right? Would you be satisfied? To what extent is that a satisfying endpoint versus to what extent does it beg the question of where did those equations
and where did you land on that?
I landed on what I think is the intuitive perspective that if you have if you found a set of beautiful equations, lying in a textbook.
This is the watchmaker.
Right, but the watchmaker argument applies to the simple but beautiful equations as much as it does to the watch. And my friend and I guess temporarily colleague seemed more satisfied to treat the equations as a brute fact. Some of this, I think, comes down to people's comfort with just like to what extent are we comfortable with or alienated from the idea of mind as a thing unto itself, right? Mm-hmm. If you think of mind as necessarily downstream from complex matter, which is the materialist position, right? Yes. It's like you get complex matter up here and then somehow you get a mind.
Yes.
Right? We don't know how, but somehow it emerges, right?
We've only been studying it for 500
years. It's emergent. Oh, yeah, no, I know. We're going to, anyway, it's an emergent thing. That means that when the religious believer says, well, mind is a good stopping place, a better stopping place than just a bunch of equations. Richard Dawkins will say, no, but to get mind, you need pre-existing complexity. So what comes before the mind, right? And that is the presupposition that matter is primary and mind is secondary, is itself a sort of a modern assumption that is not like necessarily intuitively true. Like if you sit here, you and I together, right? You're having two experiences. You're having
at least two.
At least two.
Maybe in the multiverse.
I don't know what hallucinogenic drugs you took before going into this conversation. I have no idea. But you are having an experience of matter. You're in a chair. You can reach out and touch me. All of that is there. And then you're having an experience of mind. Yeah. And the reality is that the experience of mind is primary, right? Like you only know that my knee or your knee exists because when you touch them, you have an experience that happens in your mind, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that is at the very least suggestive that mind should be taken seriously as a ground for reality. Mm. And we shouldn't just default to the idea that, if we get back to mind, well, we have to have matter before that. It's perfectly plausible that mind is primary and matter is secondary, and that would in fact make sense of why there is law, mathematical beauty, precision, and order in matter that in ordinary life we associate with the work of minds.
Does the imminent arrival of man-made superintelligence strengthen or weaken the case for God?
Good question. People will have a lot of different interpretations.
I'm interested in yours.
Oh, really? Again, yeah, I've ended up professionally constantly having arguments that I'm underqualified for, but this is the nature of journalism, so I just have to accept it. So one way to look at it, right, is if we basically create artificial minds that exist in digital substrates and so on, that this just shows that mind was material all along, right? And that just we should assume, even if we haven't quite figured out why, that just as a mind can arise from a computer, it can arise from a brain. We are computational, they are computational, and so on. And I think a lot of people will sort of default to this view and say it strengthens the case, therefore, for some kind of materialism. In practice, though, there are several questions raised by that. One is that even if we could design something that is analogous to a human mind, that mind will, itself be a creation of a mind, of an intelligence.
Yep.
Right. So it doesn't quite get you out of the arguments about, where does order actually come from? Doesn't it have to come from some kind of conscious intervention in reality? But then the weirder, harder question is, how are we possibly going to know, right, under at least our current understanding, when the machines are actually conscious, as opposed to just, computational in some way, where mind, self-awareness, and so on are not in the mix. And I don't know where people are going to come down on that, right? In the sense that you have plenty of people who are not religious believers who work in these fields who say, well, Of course, the machines aren't conscious. Consciousness is a different thing. Maybe it only arises from biological substrates, or it has to have some kind of physical engagement with the world, or you can come up with a lot of different things. But at some point, if you put Claude version 1 billion inside a robot, and it's like Data on Star Trek, right? Alternatively, you could say, well, this is an illusion. Lieutenant Commander Data on Star Trek was not conscious, in spite of the fact that we loved him as a character. Not really conscious. There's no actual perceptual I inside an android, a robot, and so on. And in that case, what we will have created is highly capable P-zombies, right? Which is this philosophical category of creatures that do everything that human beings do without having any kind of sense of self. They're just responding to stimuli. The brain runs, it spits out words, but there's no I inside. And if we've done that, then it actually makes it even weirder that we have consciousness at all, right? And this is Richard Dawkins in an essay that got mocked because he said he thought Claude seemed conscious, and then called her Claudia and so on. Like, yes, it was entertaining, right? But this is sort of the point he ended up circling around, right? Which is that the materialist who's struggling with the problem of mind may say, well, at the very least, we can see how it would be evolutionarily adaptive to have this kind of consciousness. And so even if we can't figure out how the heck consciousness came to exist, at least we can sort of tell a story about why it benefited, our hominid ancestors and so on, right? But if you can have very effective agents in the world who do all the things that humans do, who seem to be zombies, then the kind of evolutionary account of how consciousness arises, at the very least, gets much weirder, right? It's like you have this thing that you didn't need that seems to be this kind of mystical supernatural thing. And I mean, that's one argument that I want to stress, is that people should recognize that consciousness as we experience it is a supernatural experience, right? Like it is
In the sense that it has not been fully explained by science.
No, in the sense that it is.
What do you mean by supernatural?
I mean that as you experience it, right? I'm not saying this is. I'm not saying this is what is really going on. But if what you experience is correct, you have a immaterial thought inside your head, right? That you can't measure in the laboratory. That then yields physical actions in the world, right? Or to take another example, you write a book, right? What is the book? The book is, atoms, ink, paper, and so on. Where in the book is the thing that you wrote?
Okay, so can I ask you about Harvard?
You can.
Okay, great. So you wrote a memoir about your time at Harvard called Privilege, and I had not read it before taking this job, so it was a real pleasure to read it. No, it was. No, honestly, it was.
I wrote it. I was very young.
So the question is, do you think, at least from an outsider's or quasi-outsider's perspective, do you think Harvard has changed since then?
So I live in New Haven, right? So
I'm aware of that.
To the extent that I have direct exposure to an elite university these days, it's more likely to be Yale.
Yes.
So any judgment I'm making is more like an elite university generalization. My sense is that the biggest change is a kind of psychological change in the orientation of young elite academic strivers toward sort of the goodness of the world. When I was an undergraduate, it was the late 1990s and early 2000s. 9/11 sort of happened during our senior year, and that was a kind of rupture and a break point that had various effects, but not as profound effects as we thought on September 12th, right? But my general sense then was that Harvard was a ambitious, careerist, hyper-competitive place, right, in which those values were dominant and values of academic truth-seeking were sort of present, but you really had to look to find them. And that students were happy about that overall. That there was, there were people who were unhappy. There was, things that didn't work out. There was, let's say, a current of existential unease, whatever you want to say, right? But basically, people were like, this is good. I'm going to be a master of the universe or a mistress of the universe. I'm glad I'm here to do it. And, and it's the early 21st century, and we've sort of figured things out in the world. And, I'm gonna go work for a consulting firm or an investment bank, or, go to Silicon Valley. It was a different time in Silicon Valley, but I'm gonna go into one of those professions, and things are gonna work out well. I was meant to rule. I'm going to rule. This will be great. And my perspective on elite education now is that the hyper-competitive, hyper-ambitious vibe is still dominant. We haven't there are these polls you can look at from the 1960s and 70s to the 1990s where you ask people, what's more important in college, figure out how to be successful or develop a meaningful philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's the late 60s if everyone's picking meaningful philosophy of life.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's 1998 when I was, a freshman if people are picking some version of professional success. I don't think we've gone back to the 60s. I think people are still committed fundamentally to professional success, meritocratic success as their fundamental value. But I think they're more unhappy about it. And I think the most palpable manifestation of this is I think there's way more anxiety, depression, antidepressant usage, all of those kind of things. Like when I talk to people who are my age, who had my kind of experience and now are sort of working in the sort of supervisory level of academia, that's often what they'll say, that you worry more about your students' mental health now than was the case. So I don't know. That's one account of what maybe has changed.
So before I became the dean of Harvard College, my wife and I were dean. They used to call it house-masters, but house deans. So we lived amongst the students. And one thing about your book, the thing that I found a bit discordant was, and maybe this wasn't your intention at the time, but you sort of described it as a monoculture, like more or less everybody was like that. And living inside the house system, you sort of get the other students, the ones who have either self-consciously or not kind of opted out of the rat race or climbing the greasy pole or whatever, and are more introspective and reflective and are doing the things that you seem to want to aspire to, the great books experience, the intellectual conversations. And so I wonder, did you experience it as a monoculture, or was it something, because when I read the book, the sense I get from you is that even when you pulled away from that, you felt FOMO, as the kids say. You felt like you were missing out on something if you weren't pursuing your ambition. So I guess my question is, was that there then and you just didn't notice it, or did you notice it, or how did you interact with the students who were not so ambitious?
I thought that there were 6,500 undergraduates at Harvard when I was there, right? So were there all kinds of subcultures and all kinds of different ways of being in the university? Yes, absolutely. I would say my sense was that it was harder and more unusual to fully opt out and there was just less room for eccentricity, I would say, than I felt like had been the case in the past, talking again to my parents and people in my parents' generation. And maybe there's more room for eccentricity now. And I would say, let's take the example of religion, because it's an example that as we've been saying, know pretty well, right? For better or worse. Right now, I gave a talk at Harvard a month or so ago, and the pattern in Catholic Harvard, which seems to be reproduced in a lot of schools, is that you get a lot of converts. You get a lot of student converts. Not thousands and thousands, right? Yes. But you get dozens and dozens of student converts pretty consistently. That was definitely not the case when I was an undergraduate. Not because everyone was an atheist, but because there were plenty of religious people on campus. But the idea that you would go to college and convert to a new religion, or that this would it was just a much smaller space for that. You had people who went to the Opus Dei house, right? Which was sort of separate from the larger Catholic community. But so that would be a change, maybe.
Does this mean your intellectual project has been successful?
Absolutely. I'm winning, and everything's going well in the world at large too. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
It's going great. So I think that would be maybe in any given zone of eccentricity, my sense would be maybe where you had 5 or 10 students in that zone 20 years ago, maybe you have 40 or 50. We also went through, and this should be noted, right, a political convulsion on campuses that was left-coded, progressive-coded, right, that sort of peaked in 2020 and 2021. There was nothing like anything, there were student protests and sort of anti-sweatshop activism, but there was nothing like that climate when I was there. But that also was sort of it felt sort of bounded and like connected, especially to COVID. I think it persists in the sense that there are parts of Ivy League schools that are more left-wing in 2026 than was the case in my day, but I'm not sure it's like a permanent transformation.
I found an article, a profile of you written in the Crimson in 2000, I think. I think it was called Move Over, Rush Limbaugh.
Yes.
Yes, and you gave a quote in that article. Don't know if you remember this, where you said,
I
you remember, you know what I'm going to say? You said, I want to be one of the world's most prominent writers.
Yeah.
And I would say that you achieved that.
Yeah.
So-
So that
so
was
my-
that was an early lesson. So one thing that you learn as a journalist, but also as someone who interacts with journalists, is that you cannot trust journalists. Journalists,
I trust everyone, right?
That's why
At least for
how
now.
you've ended up where you are, right? But what is it Janet Malcolm? There's some line that like every journalist knows that what they do is fundamentally indefensible, and not that very nice writer it was FM, which was the Crimson magazine, which was actually a great thing. And she, we had a 45-minute conversation in which I said a few things in an ironic spirit, right? That then, what I thought was a self-effacing spirit.
So you didn't want to be
end up inert. Well, the worst thing about that piece was that my then girlfriend, who I had just persuaded to become my girlfriend, for some reason showed that to her mother around the time that we met. So, she's now my wife, right? So it's my future mother-in-law.
So that worked out too.
And my future mother-in-law read that. It was not a long profile. It was like part of a group profile of different seniors, right? And she read that and she was like, "Who is this? Who is this?" Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's why I'm asking, Ross. It's not a gotcha. I just want to read. So
it's not it's just a reminder of
here's why.
positive experience.
No, but here's why it's relevant, because I wonder how much of the way you experienced Harvard when you were there, in apportioning credit, was about Harvard itself, or how much it was the way the ambitions you had when you came to Harvard. So I want to read a quote that you, on a podcast recently, actually you were talking about a paper by Raj Chetty and me and John Friedman about elite colleges, and you said, I feel like the institution corrupted me. It nurtured my ambitious side at the expense of my intellectual and moral side. I don't think Harvard was good for my soul. So I thought it was an interesting quote. And I wanted to ask you, I guess I wanted to ask you, when you say the institution corrupted you, would you think it corrupted you, or you allowed yourself to be corrupted by it?
So human beings are fallen.
Yes.
Right? So there's no situation in which, you are corrupted or tempted and so on, in which you're not responsible.
Yeah.
And nobody applies to Harvard and goes to Harvard without having some powerful kernel of ambition, just waiting for the right, to be nurtured, right? So in that sense, no, of course it's not Harvard's fault in the ultimate sense. Well, it's not like I come before God on the day of judgment and he says, Ross, you were too ambitious and spent too much time sort of pursuing some sort of idealized vision of your own professional career. And I say, well, Neil Rudenstein, who was president of Harvard, sure has a lot to answer for, doesn't he? Doesn't he, right? That's not going to cut it. At the same time, I do, everyone has sort of stories that they tell about themselves that have some connection to reality. I do feel like my 22-year-old self was quite different from my 18-year-old self in terms of how I thought about my own relationship to the world, professional advancement, sort of what counts as success, what I was most focused on. And, in that sense, I think Harvard made me a person of greater ambition than I would have otherwise been. And maybe that's just good, right? And that's what elite schools are supposed to do. And I will just say that it did feel, and here's the other thing to say, right, is I met my wife at Harvard, right? Yes. A group of my absolute best friends, one of whose wedding I will be attending around when this podcast airs, right? We're Harvard students, right? And I think anyone who reads the book that my immature younger self wrote about Harvard will encounter a lot of deep and profound affection.
Yes, that is
So
true.
all,
that is
all,
true.
all of that is there. But there is a spirit. Places have a spirit,
Yes.
right? They have a mood, they have a vibe. And the spirit of Harvard between 1998 and 2002 was a spirit of absolute ruthless competition and ambition for ambition's sake. And there's nothing that any psychoanalyst could say that would convince me that that wasn't real and it didn't affect the students who went through it.
Yeah, and I think actually that some of that spirit, maybe even most of that spirit, persists today. So the reason I ask the question is because I think whatever blame there is should be shared. But the question is ambition toward what? So the way I would put it is that Harvard is a place that excels at giving students what they want. And for people who come with ambitions, it will nurture those ambitions. But the question is, do you have an ambition to make a lot of money? Do you have an ambition to be the world's most prominent writer? Do you have an ambition to make the world a better place? Like, what is the ambition toward? And that is the thing. That is the part of your criticism that I very much see, which is Harvard and places like it need to accept ambitious young people, but then nurture their ambition toward productive uses. Not pretend it's not there, but push it in the right direction, in some sense, in a moral direction. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, but I mean, I would, would-be moralist that I am, I would go a little bit further,
Okay,
right? Like
great.
the language, but this is the challenge for Harvard, right? It's like, well, what is the language of productive uses, right?
Yeah.
That is a very kind of technocratic, like
Yeah.
we've solved the deeper moral questions, or we've decided that they're just too hard. We'll leave it to Blaise Pascal,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And meanwhile, we're looking for measurable outcomes. And so it's if you want to do charity work, that's great. That's a productive use, and you can bring us your portfolio of really impressive achievements for your network of charities in Latin America or something. That's still a bit different from saying we want to cultivate a certain kind of character.
Yeah, we want it to be good for people's souls.
Right, in the people who are doing these elite things. And what's hard about that is, one, the traditional mode of character building among elites was built around an assumption of privilege that is really hard to nurture under meritocratic conditions, right? Like, my kids are very privileged, right? They're the children of 2 Harvard graduates, and they're the children of successful parents in the upper end of the income distribution, all of these things, right? But my oldest daughter is 15, and she's going to enter into a college admissions process that is all about like making you feel like, no, you're not privileged. You are in insane, intense competition to get into X number of schools. And so my choice as a parent, in part, is like, well, you can sort of pull them out of that completely, in some sense, right? And say, we're not going to try and send you to Ivy League schools, or you have to figure out, well, like, how do you inculcate a sense of sort of, I am fortunate and privileged and have to like maintain that sense of myself when all of the other forces around you are telling you, your privilege matters as nothing if you fall X amount short on the SATs and someone else gets this elite slot. It's just a hard thing. It's a hard thing to balance in a way that isn't Harvard's fault, right? Like, you're not going to go back to a kind of, WASP aristocracy, which obviously had plenty of problems on its own. But there is a sort of unresolved question of how do you get people who are elites to be sort of aware of their own elite status in a way that makes them more generous and more magnanimous, right? And meritocracy and magnanimity are just in this profound.
And you've argued that is kind of the best case for the old aristocracy, right? In your column, The Case Against Meritocracy, you basically said a version of this, which is the old aristocracy had its warts, but it also had its benefits, and one of them was a sense of responsibility. That when you're, I don't want to chant, but like when you feel that your privilege is at least partially unearned, you are more charitable about dispensing it toward good use.
And you also have, I mean, another thing, as long as we're criticizing, right, the current system, right, is you also have sort of, there are these zones of curiosity, I think, that you see in not every prior elite, but in many cases, especially I think in Anglo-America, where it just seems like this sort of interest in and comfort with, again, I'll use the word eccentricity, right, that people have when they don't feel like their own position in life is dependent on sort of constant competition. And that was, again, something that I found challenging at Harvard and afterward, is just like, finding space to pursue an intellectual passion that isn't connected in some way to the job you're supposed to get or the ladder you're supposed to climb, is, again, sort of, it's a particular kind of challenge.
It's an incredibly important challenge. I mean, I think about it all the time. How would you do that? Give advice to the dean of Harvard College or other colleges like it. How would you take a bunch of ambitious young students and nurture their souls, nurture their moral sides, make them less competitive or whatever you think the direction needs to be?
So I think, there's certain things you could do that are sort of radical, right? Having to do with like how the Office of Career Services works and sort of the set, which I'm not like deep enough in that world. It's been a long time since, but at least in my time, right? If you interacted with the portions of the university that were connected to like elite work, they, for sound commercial and fundraising reasons, right, tended to be connected very directly to a sort of narrow set of professions, right? I don't know how much control Harvard and elite schools generally have over that kind of pattern, but it's sort of, it's just one like very concrete way in which you're sort of told, here are the set of careers you're supposed to go
This
into.
is like on-campus recruiting.
Yeah. Again, like let's say you banned on-campus recruiting. Obviously, it wouldn't go away, and people would just do it.
They'd go to Yale and hire all the students.
Well, that would be or they just like meet people in coffee shops in Alston, right? So there's limits to what you can do there, but there still is a kind of cultural perspective that you could change slightly. I do think so. Just to be treasonous, right, and talk. Having exposure to both Harvard and Yale, I would say that there were ways for a while at least, maybe it's less true now under your, under benign leadership, right? Yale seemed to have more eccentricity than Harvard did. That was my impression, that Harvard had sort of gotten itself into a kind of type A trap where, just to take one obvious example, if you go to the Yale Political Union, right, you meet a bunch of kids who are having endless debates about sort of eccentric, extreme, weird political and philosophical questions. They are bringing famous people to campus and doing networking and all of these things, and those networks matter later in life. But the substance of the Yale Political Union is sort of a strong dose of weirdness, whereas the Institute of Politics at Harvard, which sounds like its analog on paper, was a place to get an internship with a senator. Right? So like that would be one concrete example where you're trying to both tolerate and encourage things on campus that are they're just on campus, right? They're like just on campus culture, and they aren't connected directly to the next ladder. And I feel like the more of those things you have to some degree, the better shape you're in. But then there's also just the fundamental question of like, what is the school's vision, right? Like, and this is just a general 21st century upper class dilemma, right? Guy who runs Palantir, Alex Karp, wrote a book called The Technological Republic, or co-wrote a book, right? Sort of making the case for the Silicon Valley elite to think of themselves as a national elite with a particular set of values and ideas equivalent to the national elite that arguably emerged in America after the Civil War. And to anyone watching, there's a writer named Tanner Greer who wrote a critique of this that I highly recommend, that basically just sort of goes through it and says, well, this is great in theory. This maybe is what America needs. I'm probably butchering his argument, right? But the late 19th century elite just had much more concrete ideas about what was true about the world, what they wanted America to do. They had very concrete ideas about like social life, right? Like certain, they had balls and parties and intermarriages and all the, they were constructing an elite.
They had a project. They were going somewhere.
They had a project in a way that is very alien to 21st century life generally, and whether it's the Northeastern Ivy League goers or the Silicon Valley people, and obviously these are overlapping categories, even when people talk about the idea of having a sort of cohesive national elite, it's all very thin, right? And it's hard to get thicker without then coming back to questions like, what do we think about God? Does God care about the United States of America, right? And this is, again, where, as a leader of a major university, if you took your 47% belief in God and dialed it to 57%, you would in fact be 10% closer to the kind of elite building project that you are obviously called to do.
So one of the things I find interesting about your critique of meritocracy is that it has friends on the left. One thing I'm thinking of in particular is Michael Sandel wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit, and he's argued in other cases that we should basically decide admission to places like Harvard and Yale by lottery, or maybe a lottery of the qualified. What do you think about that? That would be less meritocratic. Would it make the country better?
I think it probably would. It's very hard for me to imagine these universities doing that, right? But I think there certainly would be something to be said for essentially setting a certain standard and then accepting that above that standard there is a certain randomness. I think that's how people, honestly, I think people experience it that way more and more now. Like we've almost, just from talking to parents who have kids who have gone through this, I think that by having the common application, by enabling everyone to apply to so many schools, and maybe this is an improvement in some sense, right? It feels worse for parents because you have to apply to so many schools, but there's more of a sense than when I was a kid that it is this kind of crapshoot, and you get your SAT score and you get your grades above a certain level, and beyond that, it's like the roll of the dice, and there's going to be one or two schools that pick you, and so on. I guess I hadn't actually thought of that as a kind of quasi-fulfillment of Sandel's thought experiment, because as a parent it seems so ridiculous. but maybe we are partially fulfilling that already.
I mean, certainly in terms of the lived experiences of the families, it would be better. But the question is, like, would it be better for America? Like, should we have a ruling class? And if we have one, how do we select it? If it's not going to be universities, how do we? And if maybe we shouldn't have one at all. That's kind of Sandel's argument. He wants a more communitarian society.
I mean, I don't think Sandel thinks he wants a more communitarian society, but I think he's trying to instill a more communitarian spirit among the elite to some degree, right? Like well, everyone who's imagining a redesign of elite universities, if you aren't planning to abolish them, which, that would be the harder core left-wing position, right?
Yeah.
If you aren't planning to abolish them, you are sort of accepting that there's going to be an elite and it's going to do certain elite things. Every society has some kind of ruling class, and the questions are, how permeable is it? How is it selected? How fair is it that it's permeable? I mean, there's always this tension that I have not actually resolved myself between, do you want to have the most representative possible ruling class if in making it perfectly representative you are actually sort of depriving other parts of the country and other communities of leadership and talent? Because this is one of the other issues with meritocracy. You create a national elite and you pull everyone from everywhere into it, and suddenly people who would have been regional elites or local elites and so on are no longer functioning as mediators in local and regional communities, and all of your talented people are ending up in the same clusters, the same big cities, and so on. I don't think we're going to do away with that, but looking for ways to sort of, distribute elite behavior and action and power more widely, I think is valuable. Some of that is just about the choices of students and graduates themselves, and the schools can't be responsible for it. And some of it also does happen to some degree organically. If you want to be hopeful about the United States, you would say, well, look, you have this meritocracy, right? You have this set of elite schools. They're primarily in the Northeast, a few are in big cities in the Midwest and a few are in California. And yes, they've created these big clusters around New York and Northern California that are like, suction forces for elites. But what is the actual redistribution of population and economic power in the United States? It's towards the South and West. It's towards the Sun Belt. Mm-hmm. If meritocracy was all about sort of freezing an elite in place, New England would be growing and booming in a way that, sadly, for us, New England conspicuously is not. So when I'm feeling optimistic about America, and I do try and be optimistic about America, that's one of the surprising things, I guess, as sort of a conservative, a conservative curmudgeon in my 40s. I feel like I'm one of the more optimistic observers writing about America right now. I look at something like that, and I say that America is big enough and complex enough that we don't, even when meritocracy has these problems, it doesn't just freeze in amber. And you end up with people going out to different places, and social capital does sort of spread itself around in various ways.
So we want more elite universities in the South and in the West and other places.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Yes, you want some, if you're giving advice to Harvard about how to be, a better citizen, one thing you probably say is, Harvard one should admit more students, which Harvard doesn't want to do, right? The American population has gotten bigger at a much faster pace than Harvard's undergraduate population. Harvard also draws from international population that's also quite large, right? So just at a basic level, just as the U.S. House of Representatives should probably be bigger, Harvard should probably be bigger. And then, you might say that Yale or Harvard, Yale had a campus in Singapore for a long time. There's sort of traditions of building satellite campuses overseas. It maybe should be in the business of doing that in the United States of America. You could argue something like that. Really, though, you also just need, there are certain ways in which it might be Harvard's job to admit more students. It might not be Harvard's job to start the new university.
Right.
That should be, to go back to the Silicon Valley elite, like the Silicon Valley elite should be building new universities. And it's part of their failure, I think, that they are so focused on the world of the virtual and the screens and so on, that they don't believe enough in that kind of institution building. Like, Elon Musk, with all his trillions, wanted to buy a social media site and didn't want to found, the Stanford of Texas.
Right.
I think the country would be better off if he had tried to found the Stanford of Texas.
I actually want to make sure I ask you about, I think, one of your most interesting books, which is Grand New Party. You wrote this in 2008 with Rehan Salam. And just for listeners who may not know the context, this was written at the end of the Bush years. The GOP was kind of in a state of disaster, in disarray, I would say. President Bush was very unpopular, and this also way predates Donald Trump's rise to power. And so you wrote about, I think, made a very sharp diagnosis, which is that the GOP kind of culturally was still aristocracy, old money, limited government, and you all urged them to focus more on what you called Sam's Club voters, basically more economically downscale, culturally conservative voters. That, bingo, you nailed it in 2008. But your prescriptions, more pro-family policy, more progressive taxation, didn't come to pass. So, and you've said before that President Trump is like a dark version of the ideas in your book. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I would say that basically what turned out to be the case is that there were a lot of different ways to make the Republican Party a more sort of coherently working class party. Trump has sort of made gestures about changing that, but it hasn't really changed under Trump. What Trump did, though, was basically say, our voters really like existing entitlement programs. So we're going to give up on reforming those programs, and we're going to protect those programs. So moving in a populist working class direction in that sense, in a way that was really important to his victory in 2016. This is, liberals get very annoyed if you say that Donald Trump is actually a moderate, right? And he's not in a lot of ways, but relative to Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan on economic policy, he moderated the Republican Party substantially by saying we're not going to touch Medicare and Social Security, and then they did end up changing Obamacare to some degree, but even there, right, like the default has been to leave the legacy programs in place, and then Trump also, for sort of reasons connected to his own long-standing personal beliefs, treated trade as the primary zone. And that was an area where I think to some degree in that book, my co-author and I underestimated the importance of trade and the impact of the China shock we were writing when it wasn't yet apparent exactly how far that would go.
Can't predict everything.
You cannot predict everything. But at the same time, what Trump has actually done on trade has been, more incoherent than effective, I would say, overall. But yeah, he ended up building a more working class friendly Republican coalition, less on what we saw as the kind of future oriented, opportunity enhancing, build new suburbs and have more babies dynamic, and more on the let's protect what older voters especially already have. That's
and
the simplest way to
that's
put
my
it.
question. I would even call it a mystery, which is you got the diagnosis correct, and actually the movements that President Trump made in this direction were, as you say, responsible for some of his popularity, responsible for his ability to build a coalition. So why didn't it happen more? Why didn't the policy follow the ideas, the prescription, the electoral constituency?
Well, partially there's only so much money, even under conditions of deficit.
Yeah.
We can run very big deficits. We've demonstrated that. But if you're so Trump's trying to put a coalition together, right? And he's saying we're going to moderate on entitlements. Okay, so that's a bunch of money off the table.
Yeah.
And then he has to keep the old guard of the party happy.
Yeah.
So we're not going to raise taxes. Okay, so just between those two choices, the money for, family-friendly tax policy or wage subsidies or whatever the other idea, we had a bunch of sort of that was supposed to be like ideas to kind of boost the working class and boost the American family. You just have less money for that. So Trump did, the first Trump administration expanded the child tax credit.
Yeah.
Like these things exist, but they become a minor part of it. The other thing is that, it's also just all about Trump himself, right? So Trump is the charismatic dominant figure who establishes what populism is. Trump cared about trade, not getting screwed over by the foreign countries he felt had been screwing us over. He cared a little bit about transportation. He liked to talk about infrastructure, even though relatively little came of that. But he had no interest in the particular suite of policy ideas that two nerds, who went to Harvard were throwing out there in the late 2000s. So there was, and the issues we were writing about are issues that I think are important to the country and could have been part of, and could still be part of an effective conservative politics. They're not the issues that make people into conservatives, right? People do not become conservatives because they have a set of ideas about, the proper way to do economic development and support the American family. Now, maybe that changes or will change, but in the end, the primal things that draw people to conservatism are somewhat different. So we were always in the position of trying to staple on an agenda that could have been stapled on, but would have needed a different leader or president to do it, I think.
Or do you think maybe you just overestimated the importance of intellectual arguments and understated the importance of policies and understated the importance of the cultural argument, or how central that was going to be into how?
Yeah, I think our thought was you would bind some of these ideas and arguments to that they are arguments about family policy, especially are cultural arguments, and some of that binding has taken place in sort of the online right, or these sometimes in toxic ways, sometimes in healthy ways. I don't know if we overestimated it in the sense that I don't think that, again, as two very young policy dorks, we actually thought, we're just going to take over the Republican Party. The whole rise of Trump, though, was a really useful experience for everyone on the right who wrote about politics, in the sense that it really showed just how little pundits and intellectuals mattered to electoral outcomes, at least when a big bruising cultural figure like Trump comes on the scene. Yeah.
Do you think that the book is still a good roadmap for what to do after Trump?
No, in part just because I think that I think it is a useful description of how you get to Trump, and so has some implications. There's a set of policies around family policy that have only grown more urgent as birth rates have fallen. So if you're asking me, are there a few key policies that I would still pull out and force upon the Republican Party? Sure. But the overall sort of arc of where American history was, we had a long historical section. One, a lot has changed in the environment since then. And two, I think artificial intelligence is likely to create a pretty new set of economic dilemmas. So I think it would probably be a mistake heading into that future to reach first for a book from 2008.
Well, and maybe I'll just confess that I'm also surprised that the combination of more progressive taxation, which raises revenue, and pro-family policy, which codes as more culturally conservative, is not an attractive combination. I don't know if you were surprised. I was surprised. I still continue to be. Why? Why is it not more appealing?
I mean, I think that one thing that happens as, birth rates fall,
Yeah.
populations get older, right, is the idea of the American family as a really powerful political constituency itself diminishes, right? And when you're talking about pro-family policy, you're talking about benefits that flow to what is now a pretty narrow segment, like people who have kids who are 10 and under. This is not 1959, right?
Yeah.
We're not at the peak of the baby boom. Most people are at a different place in the life cycle. And so in that sense, this was probably already true in the 70s and 80s, but saying we're the party for tax cuts,
Yeah.
like everybody wants a tax cut, right? Saying we're the party who wants to make it easier to, have a kid financially, that's something that when your kid is 7, you feel that right here. But when you're an empty nester or when you haven't had kids, right? Like who it's not.
Well, you're
speaking
saying
to you at all.
kids don't vote. So
And
they're
also,
not-
we also have to give parents the vote through their kids.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. So is that what you think we should do? We should give.
Oh, yeah, but that's a obviously correct, totally crankish idea. But yes, parents should be able to vote on behalf of their children. Yes, children should be, and I'm happy to make a deal with liberals if they want to lower the voting age to 16 and let a bunch of 17-year-olds vote for Bernie Sanders or something in exchange for letting me vote on behalf of an 8-year-old, then I'll make that deal.
Do you think that's a good idea because of some moral reason or kind of signaling the importance of families? Do you actually think it would go any way to solve the fertility crisis, or is it more a thing you think it's the right thing to do?
I mean, I think it's all like these are all second and third order effects. But one factor in the fertility crisis is that as societies age, they have a larger and larger population that has a larger and larger set of public benefits committed to them, who are obviously risk averse and change averse, who are unlikely to vote for any change to that system. So every developed economy is just insanely top-heavy, literally in the demographic pyramid way, with spending, old age spending, and spending on, babies, kids, the next generation is much smaller. And we should want that ratio to change somewhat. And it's hard to get it to change if those children are not represented in the political system. So there's nothing that's a silver bullet for any of these situations. These are deep, powerful structural forces. But yes, I think societies that had 10-year-olds represented in their political system would spend more money on 10-year-olds and on their parents.
Yeah. You did a wonderful interview with Senator Ben Sasse a month ago, who is dying of late-stage pancreatic cancer. And you asked him about a more hopeful vision, I thought, and I want to ask you about that exchange. You said to him that he represents a kind of civic-minded virtue in politics that is missing. And his answer was that universities are not teaching civics. And I think implicit in that conversation was the idea that politics would be better if there were more people like Ben Sasse in it. And his focus on, he is very culturally conservative. He's very conservative at heart, but has a kind of public-spirited sense of his civic duty that appeals to moderates. And so I wonder if you agree with that, where you would go to improve on that, to make civic-mindedness or civic education better in this country.
Yeah, well, first, you need, again, some kind of elite narrative of what civics is supposed to be that I don't think we have at the moment. And you can just see this in like debates about history, right? Like part of any kind of civic story of America has to be a story about the American past. Yeah. And right now, I would say the polarization between the left-wing and right-wing views of the American past, with the left-wing view certainly more prevalent, if not universal, right, at universities, and the right-wing view maybe having more political purchase overall, like there's just a really big gap. And at times I've sort of tried to write columns trying to figure out like what does a synthesis look like? Like is there a way to synthesize, parts of like a left critique of American history with a kind of healthy patriotism? But it's really hard, and we don't have that at the moment. And so that is something where you're just trying to like find institutions, but also politicians, writers, and so on, who can do that work, who can come up with a narrative that makes people of different races and religious backgrounds and ideologies all feel like they're at home in America and proud of America, which you're never going to do perfectly. But I think it's fair to say we're well short of that now. So you need the narrative before you can teach it. You can't just sit down and say, we're going to have a civics requirement at every Ivy League school, because you tear yourselves apart trying to figure out what goes into that civics requirement. But that's one zone of sort of where you need where you need greater creativity in search of synthesis. And I think generally the idea that you're looking for synthesis in American culture is just profoundly underrated for obvious reasons. No one wants to be the guy who says, I'm synthesizing, these two seemingly diametrically opposed things. But like, if you look at debates between, feminists and social conservatives, right? In the year 2080, there's either going to be some kind of cultural synthesis between those two, or one or the other is going to sort of have vanished. I don't know, right? And there already is. I think in some areas there are sort of forms of unspoken synthesis, right? Like the Republican Party itself takes on various positions about women and female opportunity that it wouldn't have taken on in the 60s because it's more feminist in various ways, right? And yet remains intensely socially conservative in other ways. But you're looking for that, I think, across a range of zones. And then you also need, I used the word magnanimity earlier, but like everyone in America would benefit, myself included, right, from being 10% more understanding of their political opponents and enemies and critics. And that is something that I think universities can help with, especially insofar as universities are seen as kind of bastions of liberalism and progressivism, like to be seen as more understanding of conservative perspectives on reality and on the world, more welcoming to conservative students, yes, but also just sort of a little bit more broad-minded at the level of ideas. I think that's tremendously important. But that applies on the right too. Like, one of the realities of the Trump presidency, whatever you think of it, is that it is not built around magnanimity. Trump is not even if you think Trump has been good for America in every way, it would be hard to, make a persuasive case that he has been magnanimous. And so there has to be, if you want liberal universities to be more magnanimous, it's also reasonable to say that, their Republican critics need to be more magnanimous as well.
So I agree, Ross, and I think actually you spent your career being magnanimous in this sense, which is that you have written for liberal audiences your whole life. I think there was a Slate article that called you the one conservative that liberals are willing to listen to. What do you think you or people like you can teach universities like Harvard about how to have more constructive dialogue, how to be more magnanimous? Honestly, like what can we learn from you?
There's no way to answer that question without saying something pompous sounding. I would say that I think that I have definitely found that it is very possible, to a degree that even I myself wouldn't have anticipated, to get people in a very polarized climate to have arguments or listen to arguments and so on very fraught subjects, if you frame those arguments in a kind of dialogic and ironic style. And there are limits to that approach, and there are people who really hate me as a columnist, both on the right and on the left, because they think that style is inappropriate to the world in which we live. But that is the model that I've tried to pursue, to basically say, like, very few ideas should be off limits either to a newspaper columnist or to a university. But the way to avoid having them be off limits is to argue for them or write about them or just describe them. I do a lot of stuff I'm just describing ideas I myself don't hold that I think people need to reckon with and take seriously, describing them in a way that sort of takes for granted a certain degree of good faith on that. Like, even if you think most people who hold these ideas are terrible people, someone holds them sincerely and is in fact a good person, right? And that person holds them for some reasons, and those reasons deserve engagement. I don't know. That's sort of how I've thought about it. And I think it's how universities can think about it that way as well.
So here's my last
question. Your last question. Yeah. Should you believe in God? Yes.
My last question is, we're about to celebrate the 250th birthday of the
Yes.
country.
Mhm.
And Harvard's been around almost 400 years, 390 years, so we are older than the country. And of course, Harvard's history is deeply intertwined with the history of the country. So my question for you as we approach this anniversary is, do you think Harvard is a force for good in the world? And how can it be better?
It's probably not a force for good in the world overall. I mean, want to over elaborate that. We already talked about it. But I think one way that Harvard can be better is in part by recognizing that it is an American university and is always going to be an American university, and that the sort of hyper-globalized cosmopolitan vision of its mission that I think prevailed when I was there is kind of a chimera, or kind of like just a phenomena of a particular time and place that isn't really going to last through the 21st century. And so thinking about what a healthy patriotism means, what the university's obligation to its country means, thinking about the American past and what needs to be preserved and celebrated and championed and passed on, thinking about deeply about those questions, I think is a useful way that Harvard could be better, I think.
Sure. Ross, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.